Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at Age of Empires 2, a real-time strategy title, developed by Ensemble Studios and published by Microsoft for the Microsoft Windows computer platform in 1999, with a Macintosh version following in 2001. We're going to look at that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Fose, Grayor, Snatch Bandicoot, NYC Lewis W., Martin Steiner, and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. Before we start diving deep into Age of Empires 2, I thought it'd be a good idea to let you know why I chose Age of Empires 2 for this episode of the podcast. And the simple fact is, I actually didn't choose Age of Empires 2. This one was chosen by another one of our Patreon sponsors, Maximus Marshall. Maximus did record a message for all of us to listen to about why Age of Empires 2 means something to him. So Maximus, take it away.
Hey CGT listeners, Maximus here. I chose Age of Empires 2 for my sponsored episode because I really like history, and this was my first RTS game I ever played. So to see the empires and civilizations that I read about in books was awesome to see and go through the ages and level them up. I hope Tony enjoyed this game as much as I did.
Thank you, Maximus, for your message, your sponsorship, and your support. Now, interestingly, Age of Empires 2 is a game that I have at least a little bit of experience with from when I was younger. The fact is that real-time strategy games and the whole real-time strategy genre as an entire realm of gaming is something that I don't typically gravitate towards. My brother has loved real-time strategy games, and when he was younger, he loved real-time strategy titles. He loved Age of Empires 2 in particular. I remember my brother playing Age of Empires 2 religiously for a period of time. He loved every aspect of the game, from building the civilizations and advancing through the ages and taking the fight to the opponents. He really loved Age of Empires 2, and even beyond that, he was really big into the whole real-time strategy genre. I, however, not so much. It's not that I dislike real-time strategy games, and I think most of you know by now that I pretty much like every single type of game that might be out there. Or at a minimum, I will try every single type of game that might be out there, because you never know when a certain experience is going to grab you and say, look, Listen, this is why we're so good. So I do play real-time strategy games the same way I do any other genre in gaming, but I don't gravitate towards them. And I think the reason behind that is because for whatever reason, I seem to have a little bit of an issue with real-time strategy games, meaning from a skills-based perspective. I don't know. A lot of times I'll sit down to play a real-time strategy game and I'll think in my head, oh, I have got the best strategy here. I am going to decimate my opponent. And then I go to put that strategy into action and I can't adequately translate the strategy that's in my head, which from my perspective is like a 4-star general kind of strategy. It's like, I am the commander here. But no, I can't translate that into actually playing the game. That maybe that's because mechanically the game doesn't support what I want to do. Or maybe it's because mechanically I'm not skilled enough to do all of the different things I want to do simultaneously in order to actually execute my strategy. Or maybe it's just a simple fact that the AI in the game is so good that it sees through my strategy and just rolls right over me with a big ass tank. I don't know. Sometimes, there's any number of things that could potentially happen that could derail my strategy when I'm playing a real-time strategy game. Age of Empires 2 is one of those games that has been so widely revered and so widely respected for such a long time. So many people look at Age of Empires 2 as one of the best real-time strategy games to have ever been created. And while I did play it while I was younger, I didn't really play it all that in depth. So when the opportunity arose to actually play Age of Empires 2 and really dive deep into it, I thought, yeah, this is going to be a good one. And as I sat down to begin playing Age of Empires 2, I personally needed to know one thing. Would Age of Empires 2 actually grab me? Would it be an accessible RTS that even a casual strategy gamer like myself could enjoy? Or is the game designed more for those real-time strategy aficionados that have really high-level skill sets, and would the game itself have a higher barrier to entry for individuals who may not play a ton of real-time strategy games? That is exactly the question I wanted to find out for myself as I sat down to play Age of Empires 2, and it is the question we will be tackling today. Age of Empires 2 is a real-time strategy title developed by Ensemble Studios and published by Microsoft for the Windows computer platform in 1999, with a Macintosh version following in 2001. Before we can talk about Age of Empires 2, we need to take a step back to talk about the company behind the game, Ensemble Studios, a development studio that would become incredibly well respected in the real-time strategy space across a number of different releases, many of which would share the same framework and general structure. But Ensemble Studios, like many eventually highly regarded development teams, didn't begin its life with the expectation of carving out a sizable niche for itself in the game industry. No, in reality, Ensemble Studios started its existence as an offshoot of a related, but very non-game-centric endeavor that, while successful, would prove to be a stepping stone to much bigger and better things. So let's discuss the origins of Ensemble Corporation, which is the company that preceded Ensemble Studios. Ensemble Corporation was founded in 1989 by a man named Tony Goodman, along with several friends, John Boog Scott, John Calhoun, and Thad Chapman. The company was originally intended to be a technology consulting firm with a bit of a software development flair. And actually, shortly after the company was founded, Ensemble Corporation would strike virtual gold with the creation of a management and reporting software suite known as Command Center, which surprisingly appears to have disappeared from the face of the earth because I can't find a thing on that software packages. And believe me, I tried. From what I can tell, though, it was effectively a toolset that different organizations could use to manage their employees and run various labor reports, similar in many ways to modern-day HR systems that most companies utilize today. I can't 100% confirm that, but it does sound like Command Center was similar to other HR-related tools that you might see in use in any company that you might be working at, or even potentially using depending on what your job is today. Regardless, the simple fact is that Command Center would be a big deal for Ensemble Corporation. And while it wasn't the only piece of software the company would create, It would be its crown jewel, and would help propel the company to become one of the fastest growing tech firms in the industry from 1992 through 1997, a testament to the quality of the company's talent and the potential that the team had at their disposal. Interestingly, while Ensemble Corporation was very much not a game development studio, one of its founders, Tony Goodman, had a lifelong love of video games, and while he enjoyed the fact that his company was successful, he didn't want Ensemble to only be known as a business software and technology company. Goodman wanted the company to expand, and if that expansion could allow the company to dip its toes into the video game industry, all the better. So, in 1995, Ensemble Studios would be formed, which was the game development offshoot of Ensemble Corporation. Now recognize that Ensemble Studios was still part of the overall company. It was effectively a division within Ensemble Corporation. But other than, or unlike Ensemble Corporation, Ensemble Studios was going to be focused solely on video game development. And Tony Goodman, for his part, was thinking that he would split his time between the business-centric Ensemble Corporation and the game-focused Ensemble Studios. And while he was deeply proud of what he was able to create with Ensemble Corporation, it was pretty darn apparent that Ensemble Studios was his true love. Despite loving games, though, Tony Goodman was primarily a business person, and he recognized for his game studio offshoot to become successful, he would need a little bit of help, hopefully from industry veterans. Luckily for Goodman, his brother, Rick Goodman, was actually a video game designer, though interestingly, as of the mid-90s, Rick didn't really have any actual game releases on his resume. That did not stop Tony from hiring his brother, though, as Rick would become one of the first employees to join the Ensemble Studios team. While Rick Goodman might have been a game designer at heart, the lack of meaningful industry experience was looked at as a bit of a risk, and one that Ensemble Studios knew that they'd need to address as part of their overall staffing strategy to become an actual recognized video game development studio. Here, however, Tony Goodman would luck out yet again, as he had met a man who he believed would be a perfect fit for the company. And this guy had some pretty impressive industry credentials. Before we get to that influential person in our story, though, we need to take a brief detour to talk about one of the premier game development studios of the 1980s and 90s, that being Microprose, the company originally founded by legendary game designer Sid Meier and ex-fighter pilot Bill Steely in the early 80s. Microprose was created as a way for Meier to begin making games for the commercial video game market, an endeavor that would prove to be hugely successful for Meier and, by extension, his company. While Meier's and Microprose's earliest efforts were focused on flight simulation titles, it wouldn't take long before both he and the company would begin to branch out to try their hand at creating other kinds of games, most prominently strategy-centric titles. By the time the late 80s approached, Microprose was a recognized and well-respected company, and Sid Meier was about as close to a game design rock star as to have ever existed, with his name featuring prominently on many of the games that he had designed and subsequently released. It was not uncommon to see Sid Meier's name included as an official part of many Microprose game titles, and due to Meier's overall talent and proven track record, gamers around the world knew that if they saw a game with Sid Meier's name on the box, you were almost guaranteed to be getting a quality gaming experience. As is often the case, though, just because someone features prominently on the promotional materials for a given game does not mean that they were the only person working on the game, and this was absolutely true for many of the titles designed by Sid Meier. He may have been the lead designer on these games, but he certainly had help along the way, and in fact, some of Sid Meier's biggest and most well-known releases, including Railroad Tycoon and Civilization, were born not just from Meier's own imagination, but were also the result of another talented designer's ideas, a man by the name of Bruce Shelley. Bruce Shelley began his career working on strategy and wargaming board games for company Avalon Hill, and his primary focus was to create super deep and engrossing board game ideas and board game concepts for interested strategy gamers to play and enjoy. Back in the 80s, for anyone who's not aware, if you were a quote-unquote strategy gamer, you really weren't a strategy gamer on a PC or on a computer or on a video game. Most of the strategy games back then were tabletop experiences, and Avalon Hill was one of the premier companies creating board games and tabletop experiences for strategy gamers, most prominently wargame strategy gamers. And Bruce Shelley had been a key contributor to a lot of Avalon Hill's more popular titles. The fact is that the board game industry back in the 80s was pretty darn popular. But as the late 80s approached, the opportunity that digital games had to compete with and potentially take over the previously analog strategy board gaming market began to rear its head. And Shelley, ever a visionary, saw that the board game market was beginning to weaken. Rather than get caught in a financially unstable situation, Shelley decided to join game development studio Microprose in 1988, and in the process would develop a close working relationship with Sid Meier, eventually becoming his direct game design assistant, a position that afforded Shelley the opportunity to work on some pretty influential and revolutionary games. And Shelley's contributions would go much further than what you might assume a traditional quote-unquote assistant would provide. As an example, despite the fact that Sid Meier's name was on the box of 1990's Railroad Tycoon, a number of the mechanics included in that game were derived from prior strategic board games that Shelley had created while working at Avalon Hill. And even though Civilization was widely publicized as hatching solely from Sid Meier's own imagination, Shelley actually played a significant role in developing the game, with a number of brainstorming sessions between Meier and Shelley to help refine the general concepts for the title into a meaningful and worthwhile gaming experience for strategy gamers to eventually enjoy. While Shelley may not have achieved any degree of external recognition for his support creating these landmark titles, the fact is that his contributions were instrumental in making both Railroad Tycoon and Civilization into the successful franchises that they would eventually become. Unfortunately, despite those successes, even Shelley's internal standing at Microprose would begin to deteriorate, likely driven by corporate restructuring and a general shift in the overall culture of the company, until eventually Shelley's salary would dwindle, as he became one of, if not the lowest paid staff member at the studio. Shelley knew his worth, and he realized that Microprose was vastly undervaluing his talent. So, when an opportunity arose to join a new game development studio, and one founded by a man Shelley had met while attending a local board game night at a nearby hobby store, he knew he needed to jump ship, which is exactly why Shelley would leave Microprose and join the newly formed Ensemble Studios in 1995. Once Shelley arrived at Ensemble, all of the pieces were finally in place for the company to begin making their own games, with the first question being, well, what type of game to make for their first title? And here, Shelley would end up inspiring the team, as he pitched an idea for a real-time strategy game that would effectively be a mix of Warcraft and Civilization, with deep strategic gameplay, a fully fleshed-out combat system, a ridiculous number of units to manage and buildings to create, a unique upgrade and tech tree framework, and overarching themes based in real-world history as opposed to the more fantasy-inspired or sci-fi settings that many real-time strategy games of the day featured. Shelley's goal with this potential future game was primarily to entertain, and he recognized that if he went too heavy into the real-world historical elements of his concept, that it had the risk of alienating players and making it so that only history buffs would be interested in playing the game, which would obviously limit the game's mass appeal. The trick, according to Shelley, was to find a way of marrying those historical elements with really fun gameplay, to create a game where history might provide the backdrop and add a bit of structure to the title, but would not result in the game becoming a slave to historical accuracy. That being said, since history was going to be a part of the game, a certain amount of research would have to be performed. But, given the game's more entertainment-centric focus, that research would end up being limited to the books found in the children's section of various libraries near Ensemble Studios' offices. In this way, Shelley could add some real-world history into the mix, but also make sure that the game's historical components would remain fairly lightweight for gamers to enjoy. With that overarching goal in mind, Shelley and several other members of the Ensemble Studios team set off to turn this concept into reality, as work began on all of the different pieces that would eventually make up the game that, internal to the studio, was known as Dawn of Man. That included developing a framework for the real-time strategy gameplay that the game would employ, the graphics that players would see, the music individuals would hear, the artificial intelligence that computer-controlled opponents would utilize, and, to tie it all together, the Genie Engine, a piece of technology that the team hoped would form the foundation for this and future real-time strategy titles from the Ensemble Studios team. Despite the fact that the company had yet to release a game, confidence was high that Dawn of Man was going to be a big hit, with an intoxicating mix of gameplay and concepts borrowed from other successful real-time strategy titles like Civilization, which, like we talked about, Shelley had helped co-design, and Warcraft, which Shelley and the team had greatly admired. Over the course of the game's development, a number of new features would be added, and original concepts would continue to be refined, until finally, the game originally known as Dawn of Man would be ready to release on the market, albeit with a new name that the team hoped would be a bit of a better representation of the final game players would shortly be able to play, and hopefully enjoy. That game, which released in October of 1997 after 2.5 years of development, was, of course, Age of Empires. Age of Empires would prove to be both critically and commercially successful, as countless gamers and critics praised the game's deep gameplay, unique real-world historical setting, and overall addictive qualities that made it commonplace for individuals to play well into the early hours of the morning, intent on seeing just how well they could evolve their civilization and how broadly they could expand their settlements. The game wasn't universally praised, however, as some critics complained about the title's artificial intelligence, which was, interestingly enough, not designed to cheat by giving computer-controlled players an advantage in any way. It wasn't like the computer had an advantage in terms of the resources that they had at the beginning of a round or the unit creation that they could pursue. It actually, in this way, it made the game a bit easier than some critics expected. Unfortunately, critics expected AI in strategy games to cheat, to win, and Age of Empires went against the grain in that capacity, which meant that the AI ultimately was a bit easier than many other real-time strategy games would employ. Other critics, meanwhile, complained that the overall game's design would be perhaps a bit too cumbersome to really enjoy. They thought it was a little bit heavy for what players would get. Those critiques, however, did nothing to dissuade interested players from buying Age of Empires, as it would quickly become a top seller for Ensemble Studios, with over 3 million copies sold in the 2 years following its release, while also being named as the best strategy game of the year by several publications. Age of Empires, by all accounts, was a hit. As you might expect given Age of Empires' success, it wouldn't take long for a sequel to be greenlit. And here, the team thought they had an ace up their sleeves that would allow them to turn around that sequel in short order. Ensemble Studios had already spent a significant amount of time building Age of Empires, and the belief amongst the team was that all of that work, especially the efforts that went into building a robust game engine like the Genie Engine, would make it so that a sequel could be turned around in maybe a year tops. With that goal in mind, and with visions of even higher sales dancing in the heads of various Ensemble Studios staff and leadership, work began on a proper sequel to Age of Empires, which would, of course, be Age of Empires 2. Unfortunately, as can occasionally happen, things don't always turn out the way you expect them to, and as the team began working on Age of Empires 2, it would quickly become apparent that completing development on a sequel that wasn't simply a cash grab would be next to impossible to achieve in a single year. Normally, that wouldn't necessarily be a big issue, as the sales from the first Age of Empires were still going strong. But Ensemble Studios was not a huge company, and despite the fact that they were incredibly successful with their very first release, there was concern within the company that delaying Age of Empires 2 could potentially cause the gaming community to forget about the game. And with continued and persistent competition from other development studios, failing to strike while the iron was hot could have had disastrous implications for Ensemble Studios' future. So, the team decided to take a little bit of a different approach. Age of Empires 2 was going to require additional development time, and the team did not want to rush it out the door just to hit an arbitrary release date. But they also wanted to maintain interest in the game. So it was decided that a small contingent of the team would be rededicated to work on an expansion title for the first Age of Empires, a Roman-centric experience called The Rise of Rome, that Ensemble believed could breathe new life into the original Age of Empires and keep the game-playing public interested in the game. Focusing on an expansion allowed the team to try some new things without needing to introduce a ton of new features that players would expect from a full-fledged sequel, and without the added pressure of needing to create a standalone, engaging experience with new mechanics and gameplay. In this way, Rise of Rome could build on the current Age of Empires framework without needing to introduce dramatic innovations, giving Ensemble a bit more time to work on Age of Empires 2. Interestingly, despite being just an expansion, Rise of Rome would end up being incredibly successful, with over 1 million copies sold shortly after its release in 1998, a number that took publisher Microsoft by surprise, as they never expected an expansion pack to perform this well on the market, especially an expansion pack for what up to this point was a single standalone game, and not a well-established game franchise. Needless to say, Rise of Rome's success gave the Ensemble Studios team a degree of latitude and some additional time to complete work on their next truly flagship title, Age of Empires 2. While Age of Empires 2 would borrow a significant amount of the original Age of Empires framework, the game and its underlying engine would end up being improved in a number of different ways, with higher quality graphical capabilities, including the addition of female villagers, more in-depth gameplay and resource management, and, perhaps most importantly, a complete overhaul of the game's artificial intelligence to act more, intelligent, along with upgrades to the game's grouping and pathfinding mechanics, two areas that the team had received some feedback on following Age of Empires' release. The Ensemble Studios team would spend a significant amount of time polishing the overall experience, constantly adding features, new civilizations, gameplay, and mechanical tweaks, and other revisions to the core gameplay loop, until finally, Age of Empires 2 would be ready to release on the market in September of 1999. The only question was, would Age of Empires 2 be as successful and well-regarded as its predecessor? The short answer to that question is yes it would, as Age of Empires 2 would be even more critically lauded than the original title, with nearly every change introduced by the team praised by both the critical and game-playing community. Age of Empires 2 would receive nearly universal acclaim, and would be recognized by countless publications as being the best strategy game of the year, one of the best strategy games of all time, and, perhaps even more importantly, a true inspiration to future real-time strategy game developers. In fact, Age of Empires 2 would end up influencing a ridiculous number of games, and the Genie engine itself would become licensed to other game development studios for use in their own games, while also serving as the foundation for Ensemble Studios' own future titles, like later releases in the Age of Empires series, as well as spin-off efforts like the more fantastical Age of Mythology and its expansion, The Titans. In all instances, it's pretty easy to see how Age of Empires 2 influenced those and other future efforts, and it's not an exaggeration to suggest that Age of Empires 2 might have been one of the most influential real-time strategy titles to have ever been released. According to its primary designer Bruce Shelley, the reason Age of Empires was and remains so well regarded is that the team at Ensemble Studios chose to innovate rather than imitate. And while it's slightly ironic that that innovation led to other development studios imitating Ensemble Studios' work, at the end of the day, that imitation is simply an indicator of just how talented the Ensemble Studios staff that created Age of Empires and its sequel truly was. While Age of Empires as a series, and in particular Age of Empires 2, continue to live on, most prominently via active development and expansion pack releases for Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition, which released in 2019, Ensemble Studios as a company no longer exists, which is truly a shame. For its relatively short lifespan, Ensemble Studios shone very brightly, and it's not hyperbolic to suggest that without Ensemble Studios, the real-time strategy gaming genre would likely not have evolved as dramatically or as quickly as what it ultimately did. Ensemble Studios may no longer exist today, but their legacy and their most popular franchise continue to live on. As I sat down to begin playing Age of Empires 2, I was legitimately curious. Could Ensemble Studios' most popular, and some would argue best game, still hold up today from the perspective of a more casual real-time strategy gamer? Or would the game fail to truly capture my attention? We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Age of Empires 2 today versus when it was released over 25 years ago. Like we've been talking about, Age of Empires 2 is a real-time strategy game, and if you've played other real-time strategy games before, you'll probably have a fairly good idea about how Age of Empires 2 is overall structured and the overall framework for the game, in that you have to manage a ton of different units. You have to continue to build up and expand your overall settlement. You have a bunch of different upgrades you can pursue. You have a bunch of different resources that you're going to have to harvest and gather to support those upgrades and continued expansion of both your units as well as your overall landmass and settlement. If you look at Age of Empires 2 and you just think real-time strategy game, yeah, it is a real-time strategy game. And you might think that that means that Age of Empires 2 is a forgettable experience, or at least a very similar experience to other real-time strategy games. But the simple fact is that while Age of Empires 2 might resemble other real-time strategy titles and feature many of the same mechanics, it is the unique combination of those mechanics and the way they're implemented in the game that make Age of Empires 2 such a beloved experience across a huge chunk of the real-time strategy gaming community. So let's talk more specifically about Age of Empires 2, and perhaps the best way to start talking about what it feels like to play the game is to go through many of the game's mechanics and how they factor into the moment-to-moment gameplay. The main claim to fame for the entire Age of Empires series is the fact that you have to actually take a civilization, your civilization, through a number of ages. You need to progress through various ages. In Age of Empires 2, you have to go from the Dark Age to the Feudal Age, to the Castle Age, and then eventually to the Imperial Age. And within each of those ages, there are certain requirements before you can progress between them. And upon reaching a new age, you'll unlock the ability to build new buildings and units, as well as upgrade existing units into more powerful variants, which most often happens with your military units. As an example, in the Dark Age, which is the earliest age in the game, you have the ability to build a barracks, a building that can produce militia, which is the lowest powered military unit in the game. If you progress to the Feudal Age, your barracks will now be able to produce 2 new units, Man-at-Arms and Spearmen, both of whom are more powerful than the general militia that you had access to back in the Dark Ages. And even beyond that, you'll additionally unlock the Archery Range and Stable, which both allow you to build different kinds of military units that the barracks is unable to create. Assuming you then eventually move into the Castle Age, you can choose to upgrade your Spearmen to Pikemen, which requires some resources and some time to complete. Once your upgrade finishes, though, you now have a new, more powerful military unit in your army, which should make future battles that much easier. And speaking of upgrades, there are a ton. And I mean a ton of upgrades available in the game, some of which are gated by which age you've progressed to, while others simply require you to spend some time and resources to research before the upgrade becomes available. Some other upgrades, by contrast, may require you to have a specific building from a specific age in your settlement before you can research that particular upgrade. As an example, in order to build a siege workshop, which is the building you'd use to create all sorts of siege weaponry like battering rams and scorpions, you need to first construct a blacksmith. That blacksmith, by the way, will also have upgrades you can research that will improve other units in the game, most prominently a good chunk of your military. Those are just a couple of examples of the way upgrades, units, buildings, and ages intersect with each other. And the fact is, this whole system of dependencies and prerequisites is fairly complex, and you'd be excused for getting a little bit overwhelmed when you first start playing the game, because there is a lot to take in here. And that's not even to mention the fact that different civilizations have access to different special units, some of which have their own requirements and prerequisites that need to be fulfilled in order to construct and use those units. While many civilizations in the game share the same basic military units and buildings, there is divergence that eventually occurs, and while that divergence wasn't dramatic in the earlier versions of Age of Empires 2, if anyone wants to see just how complex the game can become, take a look at the modern version of Age of Empires 2, which has tens of different civilizations, all of whom have specific units and upgrade paths to learn and exploit. Luckily, all of these different upgrades, dependencies, and prerequisites are captured in-game as part of your tech tree, which is viewable at any time you want, making it so that you can see your overall progress towards a certain capability, unit, or building, and also determine what you might be missing in order to build the unit or structure that you want to build. And, like we've been talking about, the tech tree does show the differences between various ages, allowing you to plan out a path towards achieving your goals. At least until you become familiar enough with the game's mechanics to understand what needs to happen when in order to secure future upgrades. Anyway, as you might expect, the concept of ages is obviously the core mechanic that gives Age of Empires 2 its unique flavor. And the fact is that how you progress from one age to the next, as well as how different civilizations benefit from those age transitions, is one of the main ways that Age of Empires 2 grips you and immerses you in its world. Another way the game immerses you in its world is the way Age of Empires 2 mixes real-world history with in-game shenanigans, a concept that is most notably prevalent during the game's campaign mode, which we'll talk about later on, but is also seen in the various military units, building types, map elements, and other features that borrow from various real-world civilizations and historical details, to create an experience that feels more grounded than many real-time strategy games that may focus on fantasy or futuristic warfare. Age of Empires 2 feels like taking a step back in time, and if you have even a passing interest in history and past civilizations, this is a mix that will likely work really well to deepen your enjoyment of the game. Further deepening your enjoyment of the game will be the variety and complexity of the numerous units you'll have at your disposal to both run your settlement as well as to attack your enemies. An exhaustive discussion of all of the units in the game is well beyond the scope of what I want to cover today, but what I will say is that you'll have a significant number of units at your disposal to handle pretty much any situation that might be thrown at you. By far, the most variety belongs to the various military units in the game, which generally speaking can be split into several different categories. You have your standard on-foot infantry, pike-wielding soldiers, horseback knights, on-foot and horseback archers, quicker-moving scout units, different siege weaponry that can be useful for either destroying structures or mowing down a wave of enemy soldiers, depending on the type of siege weapon, and several different naval vessels, including transports to bring your soldiers from one landmass to another. And across those categories of military units, there's a fairly interesting balancing system at play that makes certain soldier types more effective against specific enemies and less effective against others. As an example, if you see a knight on horseback approaching your position, you probably don't want to send your swordsman after him, because the knight will have the advantage and will, in all likelihood, destroy your forces. If, however, you have a pike-wielding soldier nearby, he can make short work of the knight on horseback, because his pike gives him the range and damage needed to counteract the knight's proficiencies. That's just one example of this kind of balance at play, but the fact is that the entire game's combat system is based on similar concepts, which can add both a layer of complexity to gameplay and also a degree of frustration, because unless you have the right type of unit at the right time to counteract your opponent's armies, you'll likely be facing an uphill battle to overcome your enemy's forces. Speaking from personal experience, it almost always seemed like the AI-controlled opposition had the perfect counters to whatever my army makeup may have been, which I suppose could have been them outplaying me, but also could have been a demonstration of the AI's insane abilities and overtuned difficulty, even on moderate difficulty settings. More on that in a little bit. Anyway, beyond military units, you also have your villagers, which are a core staple of maintaining and developing whatever towns and settlements you end up making in the game. Villagers can be created at the town center, and as your population grows, you need to make sure that your town has ample housing to support any villagers and other units that you may need to create. And the way to do that is to make more villagers to make more houses. Because, as you'll quickly discover, villagers are the lifeblood of your civilization. Villagers are used for literally everything in the game, short of direct combat, though you can technically use villagers to fight other units as well in a pinch. Most of the time, though, you're going to be using your villagers to build various buildings, gather various resources, and repair damaged structures, all of which the villagers do really well. Of those activities, resource gathering is going to become critically important as you play the game, because you need resources to do pretty much everything. Luckily, resource gathering in Age of Empires 2 is pretty darn simple, as all you need to do is assign a villager to a particular resource gathering spot, and they'll happily work to gather that resource until it's depleted. By default, any resources gathered by villagers will be transported to your town center, which is fine when your settlement is just starting out, but becomes less fine the more spread out your city becomes. Eventually, you'll want to construct special buildings near different resource gathering nodes, like lumber camps next to a forest, or a mine next to a gold deposit, which serves a couple of different purposes. For one, that building can act as a storage center for that resource, making gathering the resource that much quicker. And secondly, those buildings may have upgrades that impart some improved skill to the gatherers in the area, like being able to harvest a given resource even quicker. These upgrades do add up over time, and standing up a well-running economy is vital to growing your civilization from one age to the next, and expanding and eventually conquering your enemies. Other than the units you have at your disposal, the different buildings you can construct, and the various upgrades you may choose to invest in, the game has even more mechanics that serve to deepen the experience, like monasteries and monks who can convert enemy units to become members of your army, the ability to build a wonder of the world and win without needing to outright conquer your opponents, a whole allied trading and market system where you can trade, sell, and purchase various goods from other nearby civilizations, and a series of defensive structures like walls, towers, and other buildings designed to maintain your town's borders against an enemy onslaught, just to name a few. There are a ton of these different mechanics, both hugely impactful and minimally useful, and there is so much depth here that the game effectively supports whatever playstyle and strategy you may personally want to utilize. Not all of those playstyles or strategies will necessarily enable you to emerge victorious from a given scenario, and certain strategies are certainly more effective than others, but regardless, just having the opportunity to play the game in a number of different ways is a great touch that really does demonstrate the complexity of the game and how all of its interlocking systems work together to create a worthwhile gaming experience. The bottom line is, there is a lot to absorb with this game, and luckily the control scheme Age of Empires 2 uses to interact with its game world is pretty easy to get used to, with the mouse being usable for anything you could want to do in the game, and a number of keyboard shortcuts and commands being available to help improve the speed with which you carry out certain tasks. And those keyboard commands and shortcuts are something you will want to become familiar with, because the quicker you can execute various actions like making new units, instructing villagers to go to a certain location, grouping your various military unit types together, and attacking enemy forces, and pretty much everything else you can do in the game, the more effective you're going to be. Interestingly, your overall effectiveness will be impacted by which game mode you end up playing, because each of the main game types in Age of Empires 2 will result in fairly different gaming experiences. So at this point, let's go through the game modes in the game, because there are a fair number that you could potentially explore. First, there is the General Skirmish, which at its core is basically just a defeat all of your enemies kind of scenario. The cool thing here is that General Skirmish can be configurable with different numbers of enemies, different allied and enemy conditions, different winning requirements, multiple difficulty settings, and a bunch of other tweaks you can make to really create the skirmish of your dreams. This mode is a very fun, enjoyable, yet still deep way of playing the game. It's one of those things where if you just want to sit down and play some Age of Empires 2, fire up the General Skirmish, and off you go. Then there is the campaign mode. Campaign mode is where stuff gets real fast. There are 5 different campaigns in the game, each of those campaigns containing multiple scenarios. So here are the campaigns you have. You have William Wallace, and by the way, each campaign is based on a historical figure. So this is where a lot of the game's history comes through, because each campaign is based on a historical figure, and within those campaigns, each of the missions are included with a story that goes along with it. So the campaign is really your story mode in Age of Empires 2. So anyway, with those campaigns, you have a William Wallace campaign, a Joan of Arc campaign, which, by the way, from my perspective, is the first campaign that features a true difficulty spike, which is Mission 3. You have the Saladin campaign, Genghis Khan, and Barbarossa. In the default or in the core Age of Empires 2 experience, the very first version of the game, those were the only 5 campaigns included with the title. Eventual expansions would include additional campaigns to go along with that, but for the purposes of this episode, I played the original Age of Empires 2 and therefore played through each of those 5 campaigns. Within those campaigns, there are a bunch of different victory conditions that you might have to achieve in order to actually win a mission and move on to the next one. And all of those different various ways of winning or requirements to win really do keep the campaigns feeling fresh the entire way through the experience. As an example, you might have to escort a hero to a different town, or you might need to conquer an enemy's headquarters, or you might need to keep a certain portion of your army alive as they march through a heavily fortified city. There are tons of things you need to do here, and there are a bunch of other victory conditions as well. And you might even need to do multiple things, achieve multiple requirements in a single scenario. These campaign scenarios are way more complex than I originally thought they would be, and that is definitely a good thing. In some ways, the campaign scenarios are even training you as to how to play the game, and how to utilize different mechanics to your advantage, and your opponent's disadvantage. And you will need to figure out how to play the game, because more times than not, campaign missions begin you with some sort of disadvantage or situation to overcome, rather than beginning all players from an identical level of power, which is how the game handles skirmish mode. When you set up a skirmish mode game, every player on that map begins from a similar kind of position of power, meaning same kinds of resources. Oftentimes, the maps are designed so that each civilization will begin around certain resource hubs, like needing to collect certain mined resources or forests with logs and things like that. So you begin on a fairly even playing field. Not so in the campaign mode, because here, the deck is stacked against you. And given the complexity of the campaign mode and the various scenarios included within the campaigns, there are effectively a few different takeaways you can have. The first is that each campaign scenario is effectively a puzzle to solve, because not every strategy is going to work given the disadvantages that you're going to be facing in a given mission. Though the fact is that even once you figure out the puzzle, so to speak, there's no guarantee of victory. The campaign mode is really hard. And one of the reasons for that difficulty is that some enemies you encounter in the campaign are further along than you are, whether in terms of overall city and military development, or perhaps they may even be in a later age entirely, which means your enemy may have access to more advanced technologies, upgrades, and military units than you do. Catching up to those enemies that are already ahead of you can sometimes be really difficult. Occasionally, missions will present you with a couple of different ways to play them. One way, which I'll call the right way, and another, which I'll call Tony's way, or otherwise known as the wrong way. Now look, the fact is that nearly any campaign mission can technically be completed nearly any way you'd like, assuming your strategy is sound and your micromanaging skills are top-notch. But while each mission is technically open-ended, there is definitely a right way to play many of these missions. And if you fail to figure out the right way to play a mission, you'll be facing an even harder uphill battle to overcome the adversity that the game is presenting to you. And actually, this is probably a good time to talk about the difficulty in Age of Empires 2, and specifically, difficulty with the campaign missions in the game. First though, I should mention that I played the game on the moderate difficulty setting, which represents the middle default difficulty for the game. There are easier difficulties, and there are harder difficulties, but like I usually do, I wanted to experience the default, so to speak, or hopefully the most balanced difficulty available in the game. That said, even with that level of forethought, campaign missions are absolutely brutal. They are so hard, especially before you figure out whatever trick that the designers wanted you to figure out in order to beat the campaign. You will face insurmountable odds as you play through each of these campaign missions. You will have to undertake very questionable tactics in order to beat some of these enemies. And unless you are a true micromanaging god, I can almost guarantee that the AI is going to outplay you. It truly does feel like you almost need to trick the AI in order to beat the campaign missions. And just so that you know, I did capture a few of the ways that I overcame the ridiculous AI that was included in the campaign. So a few of the ways that I attempted to overcome this AI were sending villagers to keep gates open to make assaults easier, which means I literally just stood a villager in an enemy's gateway so that the gate couldn't rise up and I could bring other people into their settlement. I would also build castles right next to enemy fortifications to allow them to begin pumping out catapults and using archers to attack enemy troops. And occasionally, I would even build a new town center of my own inside of an enemy's fortifications, in a move that, at least in my head, I rationalized as being a super covert, clandestine, undercover operation, as opposed to me simply exploiting the fact that the AI didn't have any issue with my villagers marching into a town and building a brand new town center right next to the enemy's town center itself. Seriously, at the end of the day, I hate the campaign AI in this game, and I was simply playing on moderate difficulty, which was supposed to be balanced. I've heard that on harder difficulties, some of my AI tricks wouldn't even work because I guess those enemies become a little bit more intelligent and will not let you simply march your villagers all around an enemy settlement. So the AI does become more adept at managing their resources, reacting to you doing things, and they're also quicker to build new units and eventually go to war. In general, they're just more aggressive in both defending their lands as well as attacking opposing forces. And knowing the difficulty that I faced playing on just the moderate difficulty setting, all I can say to any of those harder difficulty settings is, thanks, but no thanks. Now, just to clarify, I am speaking right now purely about the campaign scenarios in the game, which, like we were talking about, oftentimes begin you at some disadvantage to be overcome. The skirmish game mode is much more balanced, so much so that it feels like a night and day difference between the two experiences. In the campaign, I would routinely get my butt mercilessly kicked, only to join a skirmish and emerge victorious, oftentimes without too much difficulty. The main difference is that skirmish mode starts everyone off from an identical power level, and it's up to you to execute your strategy, whatever that may be, to progress faster than your opponents and hopefully defeat them. The campaign scenarios have none of that balance, and in the process can become incredibly frustrating experiences to attempt to conquer. So much so that by the time I got into the later campaigns, I simply wanted them to be over, because most of what I felt was anger and frustration as opposed to fun. I'm not saying there isn't goodness here, and the way the campaigns are presented, with a mini cutscene and narration preceding every mission to add some historical perspective to the mix, is awesome, and something I truly loved about the campaign in the game. All I'm saying is, playing Age of Empires 2 in the campaign mode is surprisingly not the most fun way to experience the game. The most fun way to play Age of Empires 2 is by far the skirmish mode, where you can truly test your skills within the context of a level playing field, rather than attempting to overcome occasionally insurmountable challenges. Like I've mentioned on prior episodes of the podcast, I am not the most hardcore real-time strategy gamer, and I've noticed that nearly all real-time strategy games end up posing some degree of challenge for me. I don't know if that's simply because of inexperience, or if I think about things in ways that don't gel with the mechanics typically featured in these games, but whatever it is, I will freely admit that strategy games are not typically easy breezy experiences for me. I mention that to provide context around my experience with the game. It's entirely possible that the difficulty I faced with the campaign in Age of Empires 2 is a me problem, not a game problem, and I can accept that that may be the case. That said, if you are a casual real-time strategy gamer like I am, Consider this a warning that Age of Empires 2 has a really hard campaign, and if you don't want to experience hours upon hours of frustration, you probably want to stick with the skirmish mode. That was by far the mode that I most enjoyed, and is, from my perspective, the best way to play Age of Empires 2. We're going to talk more about playing Age of Empires 2 and all of the different components of the game in just a couple minutes. First though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos. Back then, when we made a buying decision, it was often based off of word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like sitting on the store shelf. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Age of Empires 2 for the Microsoft Windows computer platform, the back of the box says, Rome has fallen, and the world is up for grabs. In Age of Empires 2, The Age of Kings, sequel to the award-winning Age of Empires, you have 1,000 years to lead your people through the Middle Ages to greatness. Control one of the most powerful civilizations of the time. Decide whether to conquer the world through military might, rule through commerce and diplomacy, or seize power by means of intrigue and regicide. There are many paths to power, but only one civilization will reign supreme. And then there are some bullets that say, choose the path to greatness. Will it be an economic path created out of craftsmanship, trade, and technology? Or a military route of siege and naval warfare? Command one of 13 civilizations, including the Franks, Japanese, Byzantines, Vikings, Mongols, and Celts. Each has unique attributes, units, buildings, and technologies based on its historical counterpart. Battle alongside heroes of the day. Who will fight for victory under your flag? With historically based campaigns, it could be Joan of Arc, William Wallace, Genghis Khan, Saladin, or Barbarossa. Conquer a worthy opponent over the MSN gaming zone, LAN, or modem. Or a nearly human artificial intelligence opponent in single-player mode. New and bigger lands. With the random map generator, you will always have new lands to explore and conquer, no matter how many times you play. Create your own scenarios. The map editor allows you to build your own massive campaigns. And finally, lead swiftly and with ease. Production queues, gathering points, and customizable hotkeys make it fast and simple to manage your forces and plan battles. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box, all of which look great. And I will tell you, yep, this one absolutely sells me on the game, even though I am not a traditionally real-time strategy gamer. There is something about the way this box looks, the way the game sounds, all of the different features that suggests to me that I want to play this game. This game absolutely sells me. The box absolutely sells me on the game. And of course, like I mentioned, I did in fact own this game back when I was younger. My brother played it more than I did, but I can certainly respect what was on the game box here because it definitely sells me on the game. Even as a casual real-time strategy gamer, this one totally sells me. Anyway, we're going to move beyond the back of the box to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The fact is, Age of Empires 2 looks really good, with nicely detailed environments, resources, units, buildings, and pretty much everything else you could want in the game. Everything is distinct, and considering the number of units, buildings, and upgrades in the game, there is a ton of variety at play here, not to mention the different civilization differences that are reflected in the game's graphics, which I thought was an awesome touch. If you play the game long enough, you'll be able to recognize different civilizations based on what their buildings look like and what units they have at their disposal, which is a sign of two things. One, that you've played Age of Empires 2 just a tad too long, and two, that the game's graphics look really good and serve their purpose exceedingly well. Animations, meanwhile, all look great. And while the level of detail in the animations is a bit obscured given the size of the game world and the relative simplicity of the units you have at your disposal, I never experienced a situation where I didn't know what was going on. And it's a testament to the work of the art team that everything looked as good as it did, despite being a title from 1999. I'd argue that Age of Empires 2 looks and feels better to play than many contemporary real-time strategy games, and outside of the typical technological constraints that you might expect from a game that's over 25 years old, I have no complaints about the visual environment in the game. Moving on to the sound and music, the music in Age of Empires 2 is all universally excellent, and truly does make you feel like you've traveled back in time and are helping an ancient civilization to evolve from one era to the next, and honestly, I think it's pretty much perfect. Even more perfect and more memorable, however, are the game's sound effects, which all mesh so well with the actions on the screen that they absolutely enhance what it feels like to play the game. I know most of the time that we talk about sound effects, there isn't a ton to say other than something like, well, they're here and they work. And yes, I could distill Age of Empires 2 sound effects down to that singular line, because they are in fact here and they do in fact work. But to do so would be to diminish the impact that the sound effects have on the game. The thing is that there are a bunch of different sound effects that play out at various points as you interact with the game's world, and the various units that you have at your disposal, and in all instances, the sound effects are simply perfect. It doesn't matter whether you've just constructed a farm, recruited a monk from your monastery, or instructed your battering ram to destroy a nearby enemy castle. In every conceivable way, the sound effects included in the game make you feel like you're even more a part of the action, which is awesome to experience. And the fact that the sound effects here never overstay their welcome or become tiresome to listen to is a marvel in itself, as Age of Empires 2, like many strategy games, requires a bunch of repetitive actions to be undertaken numerous times over the course of a given play session, and it would have been very easy for the sound effects to do one of two things: either blend into the background and be forgotten, or to become so irritating to listen to that you'd rather they be turned off. Age of Empires 2 manages to sidestep both of those potential outcomes, as its sound effects remain interesting to experience and listen to, whether you've played the game for 5 minutes or 5 hours straight. They're that well integrated into the game, and that well made, that they became a core feature of the entire experience, which is not something I can say with many games' sound effects. Beyond the sound effects, the overall audio in the game is nothing short of superb, and I have literally no complaints or critiques. Sound design is something Age of Empires 2 did really well, and that's not even to mention the voice work for the different campaign scenario narrators, all of which sound professionally acted and believably performed. There's not a single aspect of the sound in the game that I disliked. This is one impressive sounding game. Moving on to the narrative and story, the interesting thing about Age of Empires 2 is that there is both a fairly detailed story available in the various campaign scenarios, all of which follow real-world historical events pretty closely, as well as a ton of gameplay that doesn't rely on story at all, and is instead driven by pure gameplay goodness and the emergent storylines that can emerge when you're playing a fairly open-ended real-time strategy kind of title. While I'm not going to dive deep into any of the specific campaign scenarios, suffice it to say that each of those scenarios has an interesting, albeit high-level story to accompany the situations you'll find yourself in each mission, and most of the time, those missions have stories embedded within them that play out as you progress through a given scenario's objectives. Outside of the campaign, though, there is no formal story or narrative in Age of Empires 2, and honestly, that's entirely fine from my perspective, as the storyline here is not the star of the show. I appreciated the more story-centric campaign mode and how it tied your actions into real-world history, and I also appreciated how miscellaneous skirmish rounds that you might participate in were completely bereft of any story, allowing the game and its gameplay to speak for itself. The fact that you can have some pretty outlandish civilization matchups that don't coincide with history at all is a nice touch, and reminds me of some of the television series I used to watch when I was younger, where different groups of warriors would be put against each other to determine which one, historically speaking, would have won in a hypothetical battle, like, say, Vikings versus ninjas. Age of Empires 2 skirmish mode gets pretty close to this kind of outlandish comparison, and I've got to say, I enjoyed the possibilities that it presented, which were really only possible by not creating a story that you needed to adhere to. At the same time, the campaign stories were also pretty darn cool. So at the end of the day, Age of Empires 2 struck a nearly perfect balance between narrative and gameplay, which is something I truly appreciated. Moving on to the gameplay and controls, we already talked a fair amount about the gameplay, the game's overall structure, and at a high level, the general control scheme for the game, so I'm not going to rehash all that here. What I will say, though, is that Age of Empires 2 is a nearly perfect real-time strategy experience, with only one glaring flaw from my perspective that really brings it down a bit in my eyes, and that is the artificial intelligence. I've spoken about real-time strategy games before and how the AI opposition will often outclass you, outpace you, outmanage you, outproduce you, and outmaneuver you, often at the same time, and I will admit, real-time strategy games, perhaps more so than any other genre in gaming, really seem to demand a lot from their player base. I've mentioned multiple times, even during our discussion today, that I am at best a casual real-time strategy game player, and as such, I recognize that I'm not the most proficient at dealing with the AI in these kinds of games. That being said though, man, is the AI in Age of Empires 2 really tough, especially in the campaign scenarios. Actually, wait a second, I take that back. The AI in the skirmish mode is actually really well balanced. It's only the AI in the campaign mode that is so brutally difficult, so outlandishly tuned, and so ridiculously overpowered that it makes nearly every campaign outside of the earliest missions a bit of a slog to play. I enjoyed every aspect of the campaign and game outside of the AI in the campaign, but from my perspective, the combination of starting at a disadvantage, coupled with the AI having natural advantages, both in terms of its ability to play, as well as in the way different scenarios stack the deck in the AI's favor, make it so that trying to complete the 5 campaign scenarios included with the base Age of Empires 2 game is not often a good time, and is more times than not a very tedious, frustrating time. Because I decided early on in my playthrough that one of the prerequisites for me being able to declare that I quote-unquote beat the game was completing every campaign mission, I effectively set myself up to need to beat every single campaign scenario, and I had no idea how tough that would end up being. Even after I figured out ways to mitigate some of the AI's seemingly unfair advantages, I never felt like I had the upper hand, or that I was in a better position than the AI. Luckily, the game's save system let me save and restore progress at a moment's notice, which meant I could try different things, see what worked, and what didn't, and then respond accordingly. But regardless, the AI combined with the campaign scenarios really brought my overall experience down, and I ended up being more disappointed than I originally anticipated as a result. If you're like me and aren't a real-time strategy aficionado, I would encourage you to focus most of your efforts on the much more well-balanced and fun skirmish mode. You do lose the story-based elements of the title, which is a shame, but the trade-off may in fact be worth it, as you won't have to deal with the seemingly unfair way the campaign was designed to make you suffer. Note, however, that I know there are people out there that make short work of the campaign scenarios, especially the original ones from the Age of Kings version of the game. To those people, I simply say, congratulations and well done, because that's a level of proficiency with the game that I personally do not have. And if I were to venture a guess, I would wager that most casual real-time strategy gamers wouldn't have that level of proficiency either. Note also that this might have been a self-imposed issue, as I couldn't bring myself to play the game on any difficulty lower than moderate, which is the medium and default difficulty mode in the game. Could I have set the campaign difficulty down to easy and had a better, or at least less tedious time? Well, sure, I could have done that. But my personal psychology prevents me from playing a game on easy, which I fully recognize is a me problem, not a game problem. Regardless, I still maintain that the campaign difficulty is not tuned as well as it could have been, and this is the one area of the game that I wish received some additional polishing. One final comment. I only played Age of Empires 2 as a single player competing against the game's AI, and I recognize that there's a thriving online community that I could have potentially played against in lieu of computer-based competition. I ultimately chose to focus on the single-player experience, so I can't personally speak about the multiplayer aspects of the game. From what I understand though, multiplayer is incredibly fun, so if you're more of a multiplayer kind of gamer as opposed to a play against the computer kind of person, you may have a different perspective than what I just shared. Something to keep in mind as you decide whether to play or not play Age of Empires 2 today. The bottom line is, outside of the AI and campaign difficulty, at least on moderate difficulty and above, Age of Empires 2 is a remarkable achievement in the real-time strategy gaming space, and a true classic that stands the test of time, and it's not hard to see why Age of Empires 2 remains an incredibly popular game that countless people play daily, even today. So, what is our verdict on Age of Empires 2? Well, Age of Empires 2 does almost everything incredibly well, and with a degree of polish that not many games released in the late 90s can boast, with an impressively complex set of mechanics, rules, and scenarios that make the moment-to-moment gameplay remain engaging and fun, as long as you're not talking about tackling the overtuned AI opponents you'll face in the game's campaign mode. I cannot stress enough how irritating the campaign mode can be. I know it sounds like I'm beating a dead horse, but it bears repeating again. The campaign mode, on moderate or higher difficulty, will wreck you unless you devote a significant amount of time to learning the ins and outs of the game. That being said, it's a testament to the rest of the game that Age of Empires 2 remains a standout experience that I believe everyone should play, whether you have a ton of real-time strategy experience or not. Age of Empires 2 is one of those once-in-a-generation experiences, and even for someone like me, who is not a stalwart RTS gamer, the gameplay and all of its related mechanics still continue to impress, which is just one of the many reasons why Age of Empires 2 is undeniably a surefire addition to our pantheon of classic gaming. Age of Empires 2 is a remarkable game, and even though the campaign scenarios included with the original release are not an entirely smooth experience, the rest of the game more than makes up for what is ultimately a minor issue in the grand scheme of things. Admittedly, the game does take some time to learn, but once you do, you'll quickly realize that Age of Empires 2 is a true classic, and is therefore absolutely deserving of its spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. It is now time to talk about this week's gaming challenges, and of course, they are all focused on Age of Empires 2. Your first challenge is to simply reach the Castle Age. You can do this in any scenario, any campaign, any game mode. If your civilization can reach the Castle Age, you will earn 1 coin. Your second challenge is to complete a skirmish match against at least 2 computer-controlled opponents. That is worth 2 coins. The skirmish mode can be configured however you would like. If you complete a skirmish mode on any difficulty against 2 computer-controlled opponents or more, you will receive 2 coins. And then finally, your third challenge is to complete the Joan of Arc campaign scenario. That is worth 3 coins. The Joan of Arc scenario is where things get real in the campaign mode in the game. If you can complete that entire scenario, you will earn 3 coins. As always, post proof of your accomplishments out on the CGT Gaming Challenges channel over on Discord. Good luck! You're going to need it. That was our episode on Age of Empires 2. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. So definitely write in if you have any experiences with that game and get your comments featured on the show. That said, and at the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings. Though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.